Darkness has enveloped the ravaged Berlin. The night sky is torn apart by the glow of fires, and the entire horizon trembles from the endless cannonade. The echoes of explosions recede, making the charred walls of buildings tremble. Underground, behind the thick concrete walls of the bunker, several figures are hidden in tension. Here, in the underground labyrinth, the echo of war sounds dull, like a distant rumble of thunder, but each blow strikes the hearts of those present with icy horror. In the dim light of a tiny lamp, the haggard faces of people gathered in a cramped room are visible. Shadows dance on the walls from the flickering flame of a candle, mixing with cigarette smoke. The air is stale, saturated with the smell of sweat, dust, and fear. Everyone is silent. Everyone holds their breath, as if afraid of breaking the deceptively fragile silence that hung between the distant explosions with an unnecessary sound. A man sits in the middle of the room. His figure is hunched over, as if under the weight of an invisible load. His left hand trembles barely perceptibly. His fingers clench into a fist, then spread out. A map of Europe is spread out in front of him. Once this man was ready to redraw it at his own discretion, but now the map is covered with red marks of enemy armies that are squeezing his possessions from all sides. He looks up at those present. Once this gaze burned with fanatical confidence and terrified millions. Now there is only sleepless fatigue and a glimmer of despair, carefully hidden behind feigned anger. Adolf Hitler, the leader of the Third Reich, is trapped in a war of his own making. An empire that was supposed to last 1,000 years has shrunk to a few rooms underground. Above the bunker, lie the ruins of once grand Berlin, the city he promised to make the capital of the world. Now it is a battlefield, shot and burned, where every block has become the line of the last desperate resistance. And here, in the concrete belly of the bunker, Hitler and a handful of his loyal companions live out the last days of their dictatorship, shrouded in fear and ghostly hopes. Behind the walls of the bunker is a real hell. The earth trembles from the nearby explosions of shells. Smoke and burning smoke billow from the ventilation shafts. From time to time, the electricity disappears, and then the corridors plunge into darkness, pierced only by the trembling light of candles. At such moments, you can hear a woman crying somewhere, someone whispering a prayer, or muffled sobs subside. Fear has seeped into every crevice of this shelter. Here, even the silence sounds like an alarm. However, the deepest horror sits in the heart of Hitler himself. Once he talked about steadfastness and courage, contemptuously rejected even the hint of defeat. Now the horror of defeat has become almost tangible. Every day, every hour, death breathes into the back of his head. The Führer is not afraid of death itself. He has repeatedly repeated that he would rather shoot himself than be captured. He is afraid of becoming a living trophy for his enemies. He is afraid of the shame that will cross out the entire myth he has created. He is haunted by nightmares. Here his enemies are dragging him through the streets, as they once dragged the mutilated body of Mussolini through the square in Milan, and an angry crowd curses and mocks the overthrown dictator. These terrible visions do not let him sleep. Every night he wakes up in a cold sweat at the slightest sound, whether it's a door slamming or something exploding in the distance upstairs, and his heart is pounding like crazy. In the morning, he swallows another dose of tranquilizers with a trembling hand, trying to regain some semblance of control. During the day, in front of witnesses, Hitler still tries to play the role of a relentless leader. He frowns at the maps, moving the divisional markers on them, many of which exist only on paper. He glances at his generals and aides. They stand along the walls, pale, exhausted by sleepless nights. Each hides despair in his gaze, but does not dare to express it aloud. A cruel irony hangs over their heads. Only a few months ago they all still believed in final victory, and now they silently watch as their leader leads phantom armies into battle. This bunker became the final scene of a bloody drama, the finale of which draws nearer with each explosion above. The inexorable fate is already knocking on the armored door. But the path to this gloomy denouement began long before that night. To understand how Adolf Hitler and his entire Third Reich reached this deadly impasse, we must go back to the turning points that turned the once triumphant march into a bloody retreat. A few years ago, the picture was completely different. In the summer of 1940, It seemed that all of Europe lay at Hitler's feet. Nazi Germany had crushed the armies of Poland and France with lightning speed. British troops were evacuating across the English Channel in panic. Red flags with swastikas fluttered over the conquered capitals, and the Führer himself strolled under the Arc de Triomphe in fallen Paris, enchanted by his own greatness. His general staff was developing new offensive plans. It seemed that nothing could stop the Wehrmacht machine rolling from victory to victory. The German people were reveling in triumphs. Goebbels' propaganda trumpeted every day about the invincibility of the Reich, about the fact that Nazi power would stretch from the Atlantic to the Urals. The illusion of invulnerability hypnotized millions. But within a year, this illusion began to crack. The campaign to the east, which Hitler began in 1941, was initially triumphant. German tank wedges cut deep into the vast expanses of the Soviet Union, surrounding entire enemy armies. It seemed that a little more, and the Colossus would fall. However, near Moscow itself, the Wehrmacht choked in the winter cold and fierce counterattacks of the Red Army. For the first time, the German offensive stopped. The bitter cold and the enemy's fierce resistance showed that even the strongest army can slip. Hitler ordered to stand at any cost, and German soldiers experienced for the first time what a grueling retreat and trench defense on foreign soil were. The heaviest blow came in the winter of 1942-43 on the banks of the Volga. Stalingrad, a city named after the Soviet leader, became a grave for the entire German army. Hundreds of thousands of surrounded Hitlerite soldiers found themselves trapped in ice among the bombed-out ruins. Frost, hunger, and merciless Soviet artillery ground them down day after day. Hitler categorically forbade his troops to break out of the encirclement or retreat. He demanded that they hold out until the last, promising that help would come. But rescue never came. In February 1943, radio contact with the commander of the Sixth Army, Field Marshal Paulus, was lost. He surrendered along with tens of thousands of exhausted fighters who could barely hold their weapons in their hands. For Germany, it was a catastrophe. For the first time, the Nazi leadership was forced to admit a large-scale defeat. The news of the surrender of the invincible army spread across the country, causing shock and grief. The echoes of the Stalingrad catastrophe reached Hitler's headquarters. When it became clear that an entire army had been killed or captured, an oppressive silence fell in the Führer's reception room. It is said that Hitler was silent for a long time that day, staring at one point, and then quietly said to his closest aides, "It seems that we have just lost this war." However, the very next morning he regained control of himself and again began angrily denouncing the cowardly generals and praising the heroic sacrifice of the Sixth Army. Through the controlled press, the Stalingrad defeat was presented as a temporary setback on the way to final victory. But for the first time, a doubt crept into the hearts of millions of Germans. What if the Führer was wrong? What if this terrible war that he had unleashed did not bring the promised glory, but turned into grief and ruin? Soon, the alarming forebodings were reinforced by new blows. In the summer of 1943, the German command tried to regain the initiative. The Wehrmacht threw its tank armies into the offensive at Kursk. However, instead of a brilliant victory, it suffered a bloody defeat. The Red Army withstood the blow and launched a counteroffensive. In the south of Europe, meanwhile, the Allies landed in Italy. The Mussolini regime fell. The former dictator was arrested. Germany had to urgently transfer troops to occupy Italy and contain the advance of the Anglo-American forces. In the heart of the Atlantic, Donet's submarines were also losing their grip. The Allied convoys had learned to counteract the wolf packs, so the naval blockade of Britain failed. During 1943, the strategic initiative finally passed to the anti-Hitler coalition. Every month, news of retreats and losses arrived. In Germany itself, the war was knocking on the door for the first time in real life. Day and night, the wailing of sirens drove people into bomb shelters, while squadrons of British and American bombers carpet-bombed entire blocks of German cities. Hamburg in the summer of 1943 turned into a red-hot inferno. Thousands of civilians burned to death in the fiery whirlwind of bombing raids. What had previously been a distant horror, war on one's own soil, became a daily reality for the Germans. Families received funerals from the fronts, houses disappeared under the ruins, and the end of the war was not in sight. Fear began to erode even those who until recently had fanatically believed in their Führer. Hitler demanded to hold on and promised that a turning point would soon come. He stubbornly believed that he would be able to snatch victory, as the Prussian King Frederick the Great had once managed to escape from the ring of enemies in the 18th century. In private conversations, the Führer liked to draw historical parallels. They say, then Prussia was saved by the miracle of the House of Brandenburg, the unexpected death of Queen Elizabeth, because of which the enemies quarreled and retreated. He hoped for a similar miracle now, that the Allies, united only by a common hatred of him, would sooner or later split up and start quarreling among themselves. Cracks between the Western democracies and the USSR did exist, but for now Hitler's enemies were unitedly bringing the end of the Nazi regime closer. Despite all the defeats, in 1944 Hitler publicly demonstrated unwavering confidence. After the failures of 1943, he set about strengthening the defenses and demanded the creation of a new miracle weapon. German engineers worked day and night to justify these hopes. In early 1944, the first squadrons of Me-262 jet fighters took to the skies, unprecedentedly fast and powerful. In June, unmanned V-1s flew to England, and later V-2 ballistic missiles, bringing death to the streets of London. Each such novelty gave the Germans hope. Here it is, a secret weapon that would make enemies tremble and bow before the genius of the Führer. But the reality was different. Rockets and jets appeared late and in insufficient quantities. They sowed fear and destruction, but could not stop the Allied invasion from all fronts. In the summer of 1944, the situation for the Reich deteriorated sharply. On June 6th, thousands of Allied ships transported a huge army across the English Channel, which landed on the coast of Normandy, in northern France. The Nazi Empire in the West began to crumble. French cities and villages welcomed the liberators. German divisions retreated under the blows of superior enemy forces. In August, the capital of occupied France fell. Paris rose up and was liberated by the French resistance and Allied troops. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army crushed the Wehrmacht on an even larger scale. The summer offensive of 1944, Bagration, tore the German defenses in Belarus to pieces. Entire Wehrmacht armies disappeared in the cauldrons near Minsk and Vitebsk. Soviet tanks reached the Vistula, approaching the outskirts of Warsaw. Europe, once conquered by Hitler, now burned in the flames of the liberators' counteroffensive. Meanwhile, in Germany itself, a crisis of confidence in the Führer was brewing. A conspiracy was brewing among the top military command. A group of generals and colonels decided that Hitler was leading the country to disaster, and the only way to save Germany was to remove the dictator. On July 20th, 1944, an explosion occurred at the East Prussian headquarters of the Wolf's Lair. During a meeting, Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, approaching the Führer, planted an explosive in his briefcase right under the table. The explosion was terrible. The room was filled with smoke and dust. Pieces of furniture and maps flew in all directions. Several generals were killed and wounded. It seemed that there was no chance of survival in the epicenter. But Hitler seemed to be spared by some evil fate. He escaped with minor injuries. The Führer, stunned and shell-shocked, nevertheless survived almost unharmed. Realizing that he was alive, Hitler felt not fear, but uncontrollable rage. Crazy lightning flashed in his eyes. He shouted that he would repay the traitors 100-fold. That same evening, all of Germany heard Hitler's voice on the radio. Barely hiding his trembling, a consequence of a concussion, he announced that there had been a low-level assassination attempt that failed miserably, that Providence had preserved him to continue the fight. The Führer promised to punish the conspirators mercilessly. Bloody purges began. Hundreds of officers involved or simply suspected of disloyalty were arrested and executed. The conspirators were hanged on improvised gallows, executed spectacularly and brutally. Fear paralyzed the army command. Even those who doubted the Führer were now afraid to say a word against him. The assassination attempt on July 20th showed that not everyone was ready to follow Hitler to the end, even among his inner circle. The myth of unanimous loyalty cracked. Illusions began to crumble even within the regime. The Führer interpreted his miraculous escape in his own way. as a sign of fate that would protect him until the end. Having recovered from the assassination attempt, he still sought to inflict a tangible blow on his opponents. In December 1944, Hitler threw his last reserves into an offensive in the Ardennes, Belgium. German tanks first broke through the Allied front in the snow-covered forests, and it seemed as if the specter of a lightning offensive had returned. But this counterattack soon choked off. The Allies sent in reinforcements, and as soon as the sky cleared, their aircraft bombed the German columns, which were stuck without fuel. By January 1945, the breakthrough was eliminated. The Ardennes adventure only wasted the last forces of the Wehrmacht. Meanwhile, in the east, the front was steadily approaching the heart of Germany. In January 1945, Soviet troops launched a devastating offensive in Poland. The front line rolled rapidly westward. Within a few weeks, the Red Army had crossed all of Poland and reached the Oder River, the last water line before Berlin. The Allies in the west also entered the Third Reich's territory. In March, the Americans crossed the Rhine. Germany found itself in a vice on both sides. Chaos and flight were everywhere. Hundreds of thousands of German refugees were rushing westward, leaving East Prussia and Silesia, fleeing the Soviet invasion. In Germany itself, a total war was declared, a last desperate step. Everyone who could still hold a weapon was thrown to the front. The elderly and teenagers, driven into the Volkssturm, received rifles and Faust cartridges and vainly prepared to stop the tanks of the enemy armies. Realizing that the battle for Berlin was inevitable, Hitler concentrated the remnants of his command in the capital. In mid-January 1945, he moved from his mountain residence in Bavaria to Berlin and settled in the Reich Chancellery. There, a final command post was prepared for him, a concrete Führer bunker under the building. Here, the Führer held endless meetings, giving orders to armies that almost no longer existed. From now on, he lived almost without sunlight, in the artificial world of the dungeon. Reality penetrated here reluctantly, but its echoes reached even the bunker. The truth was inexorable. In mid-March 1945, during a report on the state of industry, Armaments Minister Albert Speer for the first time dared to admit, in almost open text, the war was lost. Previously, no one had dared to say something like that in the presence of the Führer. Hitler was at first stunned, and then exploded with anger. He gave Speer 24 hours to think over his words. The next day, Speer meekly retracted his words, calling them feverish. Satisfied, Hitler gave him his portrait, but for a long time he could not sign his autograph. His hands were shaking. This episode confirmed what was already clear to everyone. The end was near. A little later, in a fit of doomed anger, the Führer gave the order to destroy Germany's infrastructure so that it would not fall to the enemies, the so-called Nero Order. But the same Speer quietly sabotaged this instruction, not wanting to condemn the people to complete destruction. In early April 1945, Soviet troops launched their final assault on Berlin. On April 16th, a huge artillery barrage lit up the night sky east of the capital. Thousands of tanks and millions of soldiers rushed towards the German fortifications. A grand battle broke out on the outskirts of the city, on the Silo Heights. The sky shook with explosions, the earth trembled, but the might of the Red Army was invincible. Within days, the defenses were broken through. On April 20th, Hitler's birthday, the first Soviet guns opened fire directly on Berlin itself. That morning, the 56-year-old Führer celebrated his last birthday in the bunker, as the concrete shook from nearby ruptures. The aides reported that it was Soviet artillery pounding the city. Hitler only nodded grimly. At noon, he did emerge. In the courtyard of the Reich Chancellery, Hitler awarded several Hitler Youth boys, some as young as 12. Shaking hands with them and calling them the future of Germany, the Führer returned to the bunker to the roar of nearby explosions. That same day, the generals persuaded him to flee to the south, where there were still unoccupied territories. But Hitler refused. "I will stay in Berlin until the end," he declared. There are still loud words about final victory, although no one believes in them anymore. He continues to cling to illusory hopes. He orders to gather some reserves and counterattack the Soviet troops surrounding the city. He entrusts this mission to General Felix Steiner. But there are no reserves left. The order remains unfulfilled. On April 22nd, Hitler learns that his promised counteroffensive will not take place. He explodes in a fit of rage, calling his generals liars and traitors. In a fit of rage, the Führer suddenly falls silent, slumps helplessly into a chair, and hoarsely pronounces, "The war is lost. You can all do what you want. I will stay here and shoot myself when the time comes." These words shock his entourage. For the first time, he has acknowledged the possibility of defeat. Some of the generals leave Berlin after this incident, while others stay with the Führer until the end. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's faithful spokesman, brings his family, his wife Magda and 6 children, to the bunker to share the leader's fate. The atmosphere becomes oppressive. Officers drink in the corridors, secretaries cry quietly. Hitler either sits silently in a daze or dreams aloud about non-existent armies that will supposedly break through and save Berlin, or about the fact that the Allies are about to quarrel among themselves. Everyone understands, this is the end. One general, leaving the meeting, says bitterly out loud, "The Führer has completely lost touch with reality, has turned into a crazy dreamer." No one objects. Meanwhile, the ring around Berlin is tightening. By April 25th, the city is completely surrounded by Soviet troops. That same day, far to the west, on the Elbe River, Soviet and American soldiers meet, shaking hands firmly. The world outside moves on, but the bunker dwellers are trapped in their finale. In the last days of April, even Hitler's closest associates stab him in the back. Learning that the Führer is in a hopeless situation, Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler decides to secretly negotiate with the Western Allies about surrender. He hopes to save himself and, perhaps, become the new leader of Germany after Hitler. On April 28th, British radio broadcasts sensational news. Himmler has suggested that the Allies surrender. The aides report this to Hitler. The Führer goes berserk. His face twitches, foam appears on his lips. "Treason," he wheezes. The person he trusted so much has abandoned him to his fate. In a frenzy of rage, Hitler declares Himmler a traitor and orders the immediate execution of his representative in Berlin, SS General Hermann Fegelein, who happened to be Eva Braun's brother-in-law. Fegelein is dragged from his room in the bunker, where he was about to escape, and after a quick trial, he is shot in the courtyard. There is no mercy for traitors. In these last days, Eva Braun remains by Hitler's side, a woman who was his secret lover for many years. She came to Berlin against orders to share his finale with him. Eva had long wanted Hitler to marry her, and finally, when the empire lies in ruins, her wish is fulfilled. On the night of April 29th, a somber wedding took place in the bunker. Adolf Hitler married his longtime girlfriend. The ceremony lasted a few minutes. Eva signed herself Eva Hitler, the first and last time using this surname. In the midst of death, they remembered life for a moment. After the wedding, Hitler dictates his last document to his secretary, a political will. In it, he appoints Grand Admiral Karl Donitz as his successor, excludes the traitors Himmler and Göring from his entourage, and repeats the old maniacal justifications for the war. When the text is typed and signed, the Führer breathes a sigh of relief. The deed is done. Now there is only one thing left: to go himself. On April 30th, 1945, a fierce battle is raging outside. The Soviet troops are already very close, in the blocks around the Reich Chancellery. In the morning, Hitler learns the news that finally spurs him to action. In Italy, partisans have executed his longtime ally, the dictator Benito Mussolini. The Duce and his girlfriend are shot, and their bodies are hung upside down in the city square, where an angry crowd mocks them. Such a fate is more terrible for Hitler than death itself. He will not allow his enemies to make a laughingstock of him. The Führer decides that the time has come. Around noon on April 30th, Hitler says goodbye to the few who still remain in the bunker. He shakes hands with the officers, nods to the secretaries. His gaze is absent. Eva, now officially his wife, is pale but calm next to him. At about 3:30 p.m., they both lock themselves in Hitler's private room. A few minutes later, the muffled sound of a gunshot rolls down the corridor. The aides exchange glances. No one dares to open the door right away. Finally, a servant opens it. The room smells strongly of bitter almonds. Hitler sits on the sofa, his head bowed to his chest, a pistol lying on the floor next to him. Eva lies half reclining next to him, her legs tucked under her. It is clear that she is dead. The Führer shot himself. Eva Braun poisoned herself with cyanide. The Hitler couple died together, as planned. Then everything happens in a hurry. The bodies of Hitler and Eva are wrapped in blankets and carried upstairs to the courtyard of the Reich Chancellery, where bullets are still whistling and explosions are thundering. The adjutant pours gasoline on the bodies and sets them on fire. The flames engulf the remains of the dictator and his wife, thus fulfilling his last will. The fire burns under a gray sky, and a few hundred meters away, Soviet soldiers storm the last buildings around the Reichstag. Hitler's bodies do not burn completely, but there is no time. The Soviets are already nearby. Those present hastily wrap the charred remains in a tarpaulin and bury them directly in the bomb crater, sprinkling them with brick fragments. The next day, May 1st, Berlin was shaken by the news. Adolf Hitler was dead. Many in the city refused to believe it, but there were witnesses in the Führer bunker who had seen his end with their own eyes. That same day, the newly appointed Chancellor of Germany, Joseph Goebbels, takes the final step of devotion. He decides to follow the leader. Before dusk in the bunker, Goebbels and his wife Magda say goodbye to their children, 6 blonde angels aged 4 to 12. Magda gave each of the children a sleeping pill, and when they fell asleep, she put ampoules of cyanide in their mouths. She firmly believed that life without National Socialism was not worth living. Within minutes, the 6 Goebbels children were dead. Then the couple went upstairs, to the same courtyard where Hitler's remains still smoldered. They took poison, and the guards shot them in the head to be sure. Thus fanaticism and despair claimed their last victim. On May 2nd, the Berlin garrison capitulated. Those who still held weapons in the dungeons and ruins were taken prisoner. Soviet troops completely occupied the city. The red flag of victory was raised over the damaged dome of the Reichstag. The war in Europe was effectively over. A few days later, on May 7th, representatives of the German command signed a preliminary act of surrender in Reims, France, and on May 8th, late in the evening in the suburbs of Berlin, the final act of unconditional surrender of Germany. The Third Reich ceased to exist. Europe stood before the dawn of a new life, without Hitler, without Nazism, without war. The joy of victory was intertwined with the pain of irreparable losses. Cities lay in ruins. Tens of millions of people were maimed or orphaned. But the most terrible discovery awaited. The world learned about the crimes of the Nazis in the death camps. The liberators who entered Auschwitz, Majdanek, Dachau saw mountains of burned bodies, crematorium ovens, and living skeletons, doomed prisoners who miraculously survived to freedom. The scale of the Holocaust and other Nazi crimes shocked the world. After the victory, the Allies set about justice. The leaders of the Third Reich who survived the war were tried at the Nuremberg Tribunal for crimes against humanity. The Nazi Empire fell, and its leaders received the stigma of murderers and criminals for all time. The post-war fate of Europe was not easy. Former allies soon became enemies. The Cold War began. The countries of Central and Eastern Europe, liberated from the Nazis, came under the control of the USSR and found themselves behind the Iron Curtain. Germany was divided into occupation zones, which grew into 2 states, the capitalist West and the communist East. The world balanced on a new border between democracy and totalitarianism. However, having survived the catastrophe of the World War, the peoples of Europe fervently desired peace. Western countries began to look for ways of unity in order to prevent a repetition of the tragedy. This is how the prototypes of the future European Union were born. And in 1945, the United Nations was created to unite the states of the world and prevent a new global massacre. Hitler's defeat was a turning point in history. At the cost of incredible sacrifices, one of the most terrible tyrannies known to mankind was destroyed. The fear and hatred that the Nazis sowed around the world eventually turned against them and led to their demise. The time of broken illusions and bitter lessons had come. The utopia of the 1,000-year Reich vanished like smoke, leaving its charred remains. From now on, the very name Hitler became the personification of evil, an example of what a misanthropic ideology can lead to. In the spring of 1945, when the last shots fell silent, Europe seemed to have breathed its last after a long horror. On the streets of London, Paris, Prague, and Moscow, people danced for joy. The war was over. In Berlin and Warsaw, In Kiev and Stalingrad, those who survived cried with relief. Each new dawn without the roar of bombs seemed like a gift of fate. The post-war world was born in torment, but with great hope. The sun of peace rose over the ruined cities. And although new challenges awaited humanity ahead, one era ended forever. Thus ended the story of Adolf Hitler, a man who dreamed of conquering the world and building an empire on fear and blood. His reign ended in fear and blood for himself. In the underground darkness, he met his own death, which he himself had brought upon himself. And the world, having survived an incredible calamity, moved forward, leaving the tyrant on the dustbin of history. Germany, Europe, and all of humanity changed beyond recognition, as the earth changes after a volcanic eruption. The memory of that war and its lessons are forever woven into the fate of nations. This great tragedy also became a great warning. The tyrant was overthrown, freedom returned to the continent, but a terrible price was paid for it. One would like to hope that humanity has learned this lesson. In the ruins of Berlin, among the charred columns of the Reich Chancellery, the very myth of the invincibility of evil is symbolically buried. And when silence falls after the thunder of battle, the voices of those who survived are heard. Never again. Flowers bloomed again on the site of the former fronts. Children are born and laugh. Life has conquered death. Europe began a new countdown of its fate, already without Hitler. The history of his defeat reminds us. Even the darkest night will pass, and dawn will inevitably come to replace it.